The leader advanced through the snow, closely followed by an army of armored knights. Their march was steady, demonstrating the military discipline of his forces. With a simple gesture, he ordered the troop to halt. Silence fell over the frozen battlefield as they awaited the next command. The guildmaster of the Blue Zone, rank 6, observed the scene with seriousness. He knew exactly who stood in his way and the gravity of the encounter. His knights maintained formation, swords drawn, ready to attack or defend. The tension was almost palpable in the cold air. Rank 6's attention turned entirely to the solitary figure ahead. The confrontation seemed inevitable in that white wasteland. A bright blue eye stared back at him. That gaze carried an intensity that needed no words, analyzing every movement of the opponent. Behind that gaze, an elite team waited. They were varied and powerful warriors, exuding a very different strength from the uniformed soldiers. That was rank 1, known as Blue Eyes. His mask concealed any expression, projecting only an aura of mystery and absolute danger. Breaking the tension, the guildmaster smiled and approached casually. He seemed willing to talk rather than start a fight. He extended his hand in a friendly greeting. It was a diplomatic offer, seeking cooperation instead of direct conflict. Rank 6 conceded the other group's leadership in the raid, humbly suggesting that his guild was only there to take advantage of what was left behind. Rank 1 hesitated for a moment, his gloved hand tensing near his weapon, before making a calculated decision. Finally, the handshake was accepted firmly. The two leaders sealed a silent agreement under the watchful eyes of their subordinates. However, during the greeting, Rank 1 discreetly placed a small, shiny object in the other's palm. The guildmaster looked at the red artifact now in his possession. Surprise washed over his face as he realized the weight of what he had just received. The guildmaster stared at the man in front of him, feeling the tension of the moment. The silent agreement between them hung in the frigid air. Rank 1 maintained his impenetrable posture. Behind the mask, his expression remained unreadable, revealing no emotion. The red artifact now rested in safe possession. That small object emanated a sinister energy that seemed to throb with a life of its own. The blonde let out a sigh, visible in the cold, resigned. He knew there was no turning back after accepting that item and the weight it carried. The masked man touched his shoulder, perhaps to reassure him, but suddenly they both froze. A hostile and overwhelming presence arose behind them, demanding immediate attention. The 8th floor guardian had arrived. Faced with the approaching horde, the guildmaster shouted desperately for his men to prepare for impact. The true threat revealed itself in all its grotesque glory. The poison dragon hydra. Its toxic aura made the very atmosphere tremble. The guildmaster watched the creature with genuine dread, while his masked companion remained still beside him, coldly analyzing the enemy. Rank 1, however, just sighed in annoyance. It didn't seem like fear, but rather pure impatience in the face of an obstacle. Electricity began to course through the masked man's body. With lethal confidence, he decided that this would be the beast's final moment. The Hydra did not hesitate, launching its attack with its multiple heads, ready to devour everything in its path with corrupted energy. The blonde tried to order an immediate retreat to save the group, but was interrupted. The masked man drew his blade, making it clear that fleeing was unnecessary. In the blink of an eye, Rank 1 disappeared from his original position, advancing against the danger with a speed that defied logic. The clash of powers was devastating. A column of energy ripped through the battlefield when the attack hit the monster head-on, shaking the ground. The guildmaster watched the scene, stunned. A nervous and impressed smile escaped his lips as he witnessed that absurd power in action. The elite team waited in the snow, displaying an unsettling calm. They seemed ready for whatever came next. The short-haired woman, however, sought her leader's gaze. She seemed to be looking for confirmation or reassurance in his posture. Rank 1 remained impassive. Behind the mask, his mind coldly calculated the next steps. The rest of the group advanced, maintaining formation. One of the members carried a shining crystal, protecting it as a vital part of the mission. Battle instinct spoke louder. A warrior's hand instinctively reached for the hilt of his sword, sensing the danger in the air. Then, the nightmare materialized. The poison dragon hydra rose imposingly, its multiple heads dominating the snowy horizon. The man in the coat, however, reacted with indifference. He looked at the situation as if the colossal threat were just a minor inconvenience. The tension exploded on the front line. One of the combatants screamed, reacting to the overwhelming pressure of the monster's presence. Amidst the chaos, the man in the coat noticed something behind him. He turned his body, diverting his attention from the beast for a moment. A hooded figure approached with a malicious smile. Accompanied by his bodyguard, he seemed to be amused by the situation. The leader stopped completely, staring at the newcomers. Their presence there altered the balance of the moment. Further ahead, the healer prepared herself. She raised her staff, aware that the battle would require all of her magical support. The creature didn't wait for introductions. With jaws wide open, the Hydra prepared to devour the intruders. One of the attackers, however, showed no fear. With a wild grin and blades bathed in crimson energy, he launched into the attack. The warrior charged recklessly at the dragon's head. He shouted a mocking apology to his companion down below, ignoring strategy in favor of pure action. The healer felt a chill run down her spine. Something was terribly wrong with the magical protection she was maintaining. Before she could react, the defensive barrier was shattered by a brutal impact, dissolving into shards of light under the force of the attack. Panic took over as she turned around. The young woman realized too late that the real threat wasn't coming from the monster, but from behind her. A sadistic smile greeted her. The traitor savored the fear in her eyes before delivering the fatal blow. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. The healer's blood rose to her throat, choking any attempt to scream or call for help. Showing no mercy, the assassin plunged the blade deep into her chest, commenting with disdain on the fragility of his victim. The masked leader, Olus Azuis, interrupted his combat. The sound of a final desperate whisper caught his attention amidst the chaos. Life drained from the girl's body as she collapsed in the snow, staining the white ground crimson red. The traitor remained there, observing his work with a disturbing tranquility, satisfied with the death he had just caused. An uncontrollable fury ignited in the rank one's gaze. Energy crackled around his eye, betraying his murderous intent in the face of the betrayal. He recognized the attacker's face immediately. The traitor's name, Subaru, escaped his lips laden with hatred. The assassin, however, kept his cynical smile. He mocked the leader's distraction, cruelly reminding him that letting his guard down was a fatal mistake. Far from that carnage, the origin of everything remained unchanged. The memory of the system's first message still echoed in everyone's mind. The colossal tower rose through the dimensions, an omnipotent and silent presence that hovered above the fate of the players. No one knew the truth behind that structure. It was impossible to discern whether it represented a divine trial or just an endless curse. The origin of that colossal structure remained an absolute mystery. No one knew who had left it behind or what its true purpose was. Warriors from all parts watched the horizon, awaiting what was to come with a mixture of fear and expectation. The tower rose imposingly, dominating the sky and defying the understanding of all who witnessed it. Players from different dimensions, each carrying their own mission, continued to climb day after day in search of their goals. However, the reality inside the tower was brutal. Icy and violent winds lashed the battlefield, obscuring vision. The carcasses of the defeated monsters lay in the snow, silent witnesses to the fierce combat that had just occurred. But it wasn't just the monsters that fell. Bodies of comrades were scattered across the cold ground, victims of an unexpected betrayal. The masked leader, Olhos Azuis, could barely contain the fury and despair that burned in his chest at that scene. Wounded and exhausted, he lamented the stubbornness of his allies. He had ordered them to flee to save themselves, but they refused to abandon him. The warrior looked at the lifeless bodies of his team. The order to retreat had been given, but permission to die had never been granted. He cursed them softly, a final farewell laden with pain for those brave idiots who fought to the end. The system persistently warned about his critical condition. The fatigue was extreme, and his body was at the absolute limit of collapse. However, even on the verge of death, his blue gaze remained focused and intense. The flame of life had not yet been extinguished. A silhouette approached through the blizzard. Olhos Azuis recognized the figure immediately, and hatred momentarily replaced exhaustion. The traitor stared at him with a smug and cruel smile, visibly pleased with the massacre he had orchestrated. The traitor crouched before his victim, sporting a smile of pure satisfaction. He seemed to revel in the former leader's helplessness. The mockery on Subaru's face was evident, provoking a silent fury in Olhos Azuis. The masked man gritted his teeth, trembling with hatred at that audacity. Around them, the massacre was complete. The bodies of his companions, including the healer, lay in the blood-stained snow, silent witnesses to that brutal betrayal. The pain of betrayal surpassed that of physical wounds. Olhos Azuis screamed, releasing all the anguish of having been tortured by the very gifts he had granted the traitor. The words died in his throat, leaving only a heavy and bitter breath. The reality of the situation left a bad taste in his mouth. Subaru stood up, laughing at the sky, as if destiny was already sealed. He declared the end of that story with absolute arrogance. The traitor then displayed the small, shiny object he had taken, seeking confirmation of his triumph. To him, that prize was worth more than any loyalty. Turning his back on his fallen comrade, Subaru walked away through the snow. He mocked the concept of heroism, leaving Blue Eyes to die alone and forgotten. However, the masked man didn't give in to despair. A defiant smile curved his lips, and he let out a sound of contempt, refusing to accept the end. His hand gripped the frozen ground violently, his fingers digging into the earth. His body was shattered, but his will forced every muscle to react. As he watched Subaru join the enemy army on the horizon, Blue Eyes began to rise. He knew he couldn't give up there. Suddenly, a latent energy awakened. His eye glowed with an intense, supernatural light, indicating that something inside him had changed drastically. The system reacted instantly to his determination. Several windows and ability icons materialized in the air, offering new combat resources. Blue Eyes himself was stunned. Sweat ran down his face as he processed the sudden turnaround that the system presented before him. Against all logical odds, he stood up. The system classified the feat as impossible, but the warrior was ready to defy death once again. The warrior tightened his grip on his weapon, ignoring the pain that ran through his body. The battle wasn't over yet, and he refused to fall without a fight. With a brusque and violent movement, Blue Eyes brandished the battle fan. The force of the blow cut through the air, creating an overwhelming pressure to ward off any immediate threat. Fury overflowed in his face as he calculated his remaining resources. The system warned him. Only 4 shots of that ability remained to try and change the fate of the combat. Around him, his teammates lay defeated and motionless in the snow. The sight of their wounded bodies, unable to continue, only fueled the leader's determination to protect them. Faced with the monstrous threat looming ahead, the young man made a desperate decision. If he could at least ensure the safety of his allies, any sacrifice would be worth it. An invisible and powerful force pushed the bodies of the fallen away. He used his last resources to launch his friends out of the danger zone, saving them from certain death. The traitor, watching from a distance, couldn't hide his shock. The sudden burst of power from someone he thought was finished caught him completely off guard. Even the soldiers of the enemy army retreated, confused and frightened. The sudden gale and the murderous aura sweeping across the frozen ground made them hesitate. The mystical fan spun in the air, accumulating a crackling and dangerous energy. The weapon was overloaded, ready to unleash a devastating charge on the opponents. A manic and defiant smile appeared on Blue Eye's lips. He knew that maneuver was reckless, but the adrenaline of the moment suppressed any sense of self-preservation. Raising his hand wrapped in flames, he silently declared that no one would pass him. The system sounded a critical alarm for extreme fatigue, but the young man ignored the warnings to hold back the enemies. The synchronization with the power of lightning reached critical levels. The system reported that the duration of that overwhelming form was running out quickly, requiring immediate action. A pillar of golden light descended from the heavens, exploding the ground violently. The energy barrier definitively separated his fleeing allies from the enemy forces trying to advance. Subaru watched the destruction with a bead of cold sweat running down his face. The magnitude of that power was something he hadn't foreseen in his betrayal plans. However, the battle took its toll instantly. A blade pierced the flesh with brutality, bringing the bloody reality of combat back in a split second. Blue Eyes channeled all his remaining power, refusing to accept the end that his enemies desired. Energy crackled around him, a declaration that he would not fall easily. With the weapon pulsing in his hands, he aimed directly at the traitors in front of him. The army watched tensely, feeling the murderous intent emanating from that dark blade. His eyes flashed with contained fury and lethal determination. The young man made it clear that no farewell or decision would be made without his express permission. Subaru and the other soldiers hesitated, terror showing on their faces. The previous confidence disappeared instantly in the face of that display of overwhelming power. The protagonist then advanced, ignoring the numerical disadvantage. He launched himself against the enemy lines with a speed that caught everyone by surprise. His feet struck the ground violently, propelling him into the center of the combat. There was no turning back. He was determined to bring chaos to them. A soldier tried to intercept him with a side blow, but Blue Eyes dodged at the last instant, focused only on maintaining his murderous momentum. The shock of his attack unleashed a devastating explosion, sweeping away nearby enemies. The force of the impact was enough to shake the battlefield and create a momentary opening. However, the system issued an urgent warning in red. The young man's body was reaching its critical limit, exhaustion threatening to paralyze him completely at that crucial moment. Extreme fatigue took its toll, leaving him slow and vulnerable. An enemy noticed the gap in his defense and advanced quickly with his sword in hand. The blow was accurate and brutal. The blade cut deeply into his chest, and the impact threw Blue Eyes backward, breaking his combat stance. He gritted his teeth, fighting against the agonizing pain and spitting blood. The The system warned that he was one step away from total collapse, but his will still resisted. Desperate, the warrior tried to retaliate, but his movements no longer had the same precision. The siege closed, with more enemies advancing mercilessly to finish the job. There was no escaping the final onslaught. From all sides, the soldier's weapons pierced his body simultaneously, ending his resistance under a rain of attacks. His spear fell, plunging into the frozen and bloodied ground. There it remained, a silent monument to his fall, as the battle came to its tragic end. The traitor rejoiced, eyes wide with disbelief and triumph. He shouted to the winds that he had achieved the impossible, taking Narukami's life, but victory was declared too soon. The fallen warrior raised his face, one eye glowing with blue energy, and defied that claim with a mocking grin. A sudden burst of power erupted from Narukami's body. The electric shockwave was so violent that it hurled the attackers away, clearing the circle around him. The soldiers were thrown against the ground, unable to resist the overwhelming force. The snow swirled with the impact, momentarily obscuring the central figure. However, the fatal wound in his chest was real. The embedded blade drained his last reserves of energy, and gravity finally took its toll on the hero. Narukami collapsed, his body hitting the frozen ground heavily. Silence descended on the battlefield as he lay motionless before his enemies. The surviving soldiers approached hesitantly, cold sweat trickling down their faces. They questioned each other, fearing the monster might rise once more. The crowd of warriors parted respectfully. A solitary figure walked through them, heading calmly towards where Narukami's body lay. The fair-haired man observed his fallen opponent with a detached gaze. There was no pity in his expression, only the coldness of someone finishing a job. He prepared his magic, golden energy beginning to crackle around his legs. There would be no mistakes this time. He would ensure the definitive end. Invoking the Archangel's blessing, the leader focused all his power into a single point. Divine light shone in his hand, ready for the final judgment. A pillar of golden light plummeted from the heavens, impaling the body on the ground with devastating force. The attack consumed everything around it, sealing the warrior's fate. Suddenly, the sound of metal hitting concrete echoed, breaking the solemn atmosphere. A trash can lid spun on the ground, signaling a drastic change of scenery. In a dirty alley, a young man awoke dazed inside a garbage can. Sunlight and the smell of refuse replaced the coldness of death. With food scraps on his head, he looked around, confused. The memory of the battle was still fresh, but his reality was now completely different and humiliating. A holographic screen appeared before him, revealing his new identity. He discovered that he now went by the name of Hosoi Subaru, a level 1 individual, weak and exhausted. A sharp pain shot through his head, accompanied by crackling of familiar energy. He gritted his teeth, struggling to maintain consciousness as his body reacted violently to the transition. Upon glimpsing his reflection in a nearby surface, the shock was inevitable. The face staring back at him was not his own, confirming that his soul inhabited a foreign body. Ignoring the physical discomfort, he jumped out of the trash can where he had awakened. He needed to get out of that dirty alley immediately and understand the new reality he found himself in. A spectral figure manifested behind him, bringing with it fragments of a distant past. It seemed that his old memories were trying to forcibly rewrite themselves over his current mind. The young man regained focus, shaking off the momentary mental confusion. With a determined look, he prepared to face the unfamiliar environment that surrounded him. Suddenly, his attention was captured by an unexpected impact. He realized too late that he had collided with someone, interrupting his thoughts abruptly. Subaru observed a red-hooded boy fallen at his feet. The accidental collision had knocked the stranger down, creating an embarrassing situation in the middle of the road. Trying to undo the misunderstanding, he smiled and extended his hand amiably. Subaru offered help to lift the boy, seeking to demonstrate that he had no bad intentions. However, his expression changed to pure astonishment upon noticing who was approaching. Something in the presence of those people caused a danger alert to sound in his mind. He found himself facing a masked and intimidating figure. That mysterious individual emanated a dark pressure that indicated they were not ordinary civilians. Voices echoed through the area as a group ran towards them. The newcomers seemed to know the fallen boy, calling him by name with obvious concern. The group surrounded the young man named Minato, checking his condition urgently. Subaru watched the scene tensely, realizing he was surrounded by masked and suspicious individuals. Feeling out of place and watched, Subaru realized that this was not the best place to stay. He looked around, cautious of the presence of those strangers. He rubbed his face hard, trying to wipe away the sweat and fatigue. The situation had escalated too quickly, leaving him stunned by the complexity of this new world. The shock was evident in his gaze. A sudden and terrifying understanding began to take shape in his mind. He observed the environment around him. A silent and masked crowd filled the place. creating a heavy and solemn atmosphere of which he was clearly not a part. Suddenly, violent memories invaded his thoughts.
The physical sensation of a past conflict and of being restrained returned with full force. He recalled the cruel smile he had seen before everything went dark, the expression of pure malice that marked his last moments of life. The image of the traitor flashed in his mind with clarity. Those golden eyes and the sadistic smile belonged to the one who had murdered him. The young man returned to reality, pushing away the visions of the past. He needed to focus on the present and understand where exactly he had ended up. His eyes narrowed with determination. Something about that specific event caught his attention and demanded immediate investigation. He walked among the people, feeling like an intruder. As he moved forward, he noticed that everyone revered something ahead. Then, the reason for the gathering was revealed. In the center of the altar, surrounded by candles and flowers, was the portrait of his former self, the masked hero. He stopped, watching the ceremony from a distance. The visual confirmation was undeniable. He was witnessing his own funeral. The revelation hit him with physical force.
Disbelief took over his face as he saw the celebration of his death before his eyes. Suddenly, something strange happened at the altar. Sparks of blue energy began to crackle over the flowers, invisible to others, but clear to him. Driven by an uncontrollable impulse, he moved forward. The need to verify that anomaly overcame any sense of etiquette or discretion. The young man forced his way through the astonished crowd. The shouts of protest and confusion from those present were ignored as he ran desperately. He slid to a stop before the altar. On his knees and panting, he found himself face to face with the memorial of his past life. The young man squeezed the ceremonial flowers tightly, feeling the fragile texture crumble in his hand. Anger and confusion mixed before this absurd scene. He stared at the blue flower, cold sweat running down his face as a disturbing question arose in his mind. That funereal symbol seemed to mock his existence. Meanwhile, high above the turmoil in the streets, a figure watched everything from the top of a skyscraper. The privileged position offered a perfect view of the chaos below. The hooded man smiled with satisfaction, as if the unfolding of events was exactly as he expected. He seemed to be amused by the situation. Suddenly, his attention shifted from the edge. He realized he wasn't alone on top of the building and prepared to interact. A confident and mysterious smile remained on his lips, hidden by the shadow of the hood. The newly arrived presence did not seem to intimidate him in the slightest. He raised his hand to his face, deciding it was time to abandon the disguise. The moment to reveal himself had arrived. With a fluid gesture enveloped in energy, he removed the magical concealment. Long silver hair was freed, revealing his true appearance. Now exposed, the silver-haired man maintained his relaxed posture. Behind him, his hooded companion remained motionless, watching the scene with seriousness. The dynamic between the two was clear. While the newly revealed one smiled lightly, the other seemed annoyed by that carefree attitude. The companion's patience ran out, and he shouted furiously, scolding the silver-haired man for the long time he had been away. The echo of the argument was lost in the vastness of the evening sky. The birds flew freely, indifferent to the weight of the decades mentioned. Far away, the protagonist gasped desperately. The shock of seeing his own funeral and the subsequent escape had drained his strength. His feet finally stopped, his worn sneakers finding the hard-packed dirt. He had run until he couldn't anymore. Bent over and supporting his hands on his knees, he tried to catch his breath. The young man sought refuge in the solitude of the trees to process the madness he had just witnessed. The protagonist observed the delicate metallic flower in his hand. That small object seemed to be the only tangible connection to the mystery that now enveloped him. Examining the surroundings,
he realized that this was Hosoi Subaru's room. The scarcity of furniture and the simplicity of the place made it clear that the former owner of that body lived in precarious conditions. Seeking answers, the young man accessed the holographic device. He needed to understand who the person whose life he now inhabited was and what dangers surrounded him.
The information on the screen showed profiles and data. But when trying to process all of that, a strange sensation began to invade him. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced his mind. He put his hands to his head, bending over as he tried to endure the overwhelming pressure that arose from within. Cold sweat ran down his face as he struggled to maintain consciousness. It wasn't just physical pain. Other people's memories were violently forcing their way in. Fragments of Hosoi Subaru's past flooded his vision. Scenes of chaos, destruction, and a desperate escape revealed that the boy was a survivor of a brutal tragedy. Amidst the terror of those memories, the face of a man screaming in pure despair stood out. The trauma of that fateful day still echoed vividly in those inherited memories. When the mental storm ceased, the protagonist stared at his reflection in the window glass. He now carried not only the body, but also the burden of that boy's past. His eyes turned to the table, where the metallic flower rested next to a dark mask. Those were the only resources he possessed in that moment of uncertainty. He raised his hands, feeling the physical fragility of his new condition.
The conclusion was immediate. To survive what was to come, he needed to recover his old strength urgently. Without wasting time, his fingers wrapped around the hilt of the sword that was leaning against the wall. The decision to act had already been made. He wielded the weapon, setting a strict mental deadline for himself. He had only 2 days to prepare for the imminent challenge.
Inspecting the blade, he noticed the cracks and evident wear of the metal. The weapon was far from ideal, reflecting the poverty of its former owner. However, the look reflected in the steel showed no fear. Even with limited resources, his determination remained unwavering and sharp. The arena was silent, except for the remnants of the recent combat. The protagonist stood in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by the bodies of the creatures he had just defeated. Observing from the sidelines, a robust man with a white beard kept his arms crossed. His rigid posture indicated that he was there to judge the combatant's performance. The young man breathed with difficulty, his chest heaving violently from the physical exertion. He held the sword firmly, trying to catch his breath as sweat ran down his face. The instructor did not look away, analyzing the boy's exhaustion. He seemed to be measuring how long it would take the young man to recover. The veteran questioned the stage of the simulation, surprising the boy. The protagonist, still stunned, turned to face his evaluator, confused by the interruption. A holographic interface appeared before the young man, offering the option to advance to the next level with more enemies. He stared at the message, assessing his own physical condition. The protagonist gave his immediate answer to the system, refusing the automatic progression at that moment. He knew he needed to dictate his own pace. While the instructor checked the data on his clipboard, the bodies of the defeated monsters began to disintegrate into particles of light, clearing the scene. The evaluator reflected on the performance he had witnessed. In his mind, it was clear that, compared to the other mediocre participants, only that young man possessed any real value. With a sigh of impatience, the white-bearded man manipulated the device in his hand. He seemed determined to manually intervene in the training. Suddenly, something on the panel or in the boy's attitude caught his attention. The instructor's gaze narrowed, showing a sudden interest. The protagonist stood firm on the stone floor, his sword ready. The atmosphere changed, indicating that the rest had ended prematurely. A slight smile of satisfaction, or perhaps challenge,
appeared on the veteran's face. He seemed to have decided to test the young man's limits on his own. The boy stared at the instructor, realizing that the situation had changed. Both remained in a silent impasse, awaiting the start of the next phase. The system announced the release of new enemies. 2 creatures materialized digitally, immediately advancing against the protagonist,
who prepared for the new attack. The instructor barely had time to process the movement. A blur passed by him with frightening speed. The protagonist advanced like lightning, cutting through the air and the enemies with lethal precision. A severed head flew dangerously close to the veteran, who recoiled instinctively from the sudden violence. In seconds, the calm returned. The instructor remained static, surrounded by the remains of the slain monsters. The young man just smiled mockingly, showing that it had hardly taken his breath away. The holographic system appeared with a new challenge proposal, and he agreed to increase the difficulty without a second thought. Upon seeing the extreme configuration chosen by the boy, the instructor panicked. It seemed like total madness, but the warning came too late. Another monster's head rolled across the floor, signaling the restart of combat. The battlefield filled with bodies. The veteran, stunned, questioned his own reality in the face of that scene. The protagonist didn't stop. He threw himself against the horde again, turning the training into a systematic massacre. The instructor narrowed his eyes, straining his vision to follow the details of that absurd movement. He finally understood. The boy wasn't just reacting. He was anticipating every blow from the enemies with perfect foresight. The sword in his hand did not tremble. The grip was firm, controlling the blade with absolute mastery. With a final graceful movement, the young man finished the sequence,
imposing his superiority on the field. He turned with a satisfied smile. His body was responding, and the power was beginning to flow again. The instructor watched the scene, his eyes wide with shock. He could hardly believe the speed of what he was witnessing. The creature advanced ferociously, bringing its blade down for an attack that should have been fatal. However,
Subaru didn't even need to exert himself. With a fluid movement, he split the enemy in half, causing blood to spray through the air. The young man maintained his posture, his eyes shining with a cold intensity. He showed no fear, only an absolute focus on the battle. The observer exhaled heavily, feeling cold sweat run down his back. The tension in the environment was suffocating.
Subaru stood among the defeated bodies. The simulation seemed to struggle to process how quickly he was eliminating each threat that arose. Suddenly, the arena floor trembled violently. Luminous cracks spread across the stone floor, announcing something bigger. A gigantic hand burst from the depths, destroying the floor. The young man just watched. Without taking a single step back from the new monstrosity, the instructor shouted Subaru's name, seized by panic. He realized that the situation had escalated to a deadly level. Before the swordsman, an entire horde materialized, led by a colossal and threatening figure. The challenge had changed levels. The beast roared, baring its sharp fangs. The creature's murderous intent filled the entire enclosure. The system notified the escalation of difficulty. The Goblin King had detected the massacre of his subordinates and was now seeking revenge. The man continued to shout, desperately trying to warn about the insanity of facing that abomination alone. The gigantic creature advanced, its shadow swallowing everything around it. The overwhelming presence of the monster dominated the environment. But Subaru's gaze remained unchanged and penetrating. He realized at that moment that something had been wrong from the start. The young man tightened his grip on the sword hilt, but his instincts told him that brute force wouldn't be the answer. He made a sudden decision and opened his hand, rejecting the weapon everyone expected him to use. The steel collided against the concrete with a dry sound. He was now unarmed before a deadly threat. The instructor watched the scene in complete panic, unable to comprehend the madness of facing that monster without a blade. The colossal beast didn't hesitate and brought down its gigantic claw, crushing the ground where the boy had been moments before. However, the attack was punished. A tiny projectile pierced the creature's tough skin, interrupting its momentum. The giant stopped its movements, confused. There were more of those weapons stuck in its body, paralyzing its muscles. A drop of cold sweat ran down the creature's face. For the first time, the predator felt a pang of genuine fear. The monster tried to locate its opponent, finding the young man crouching calmly, awaiting the perfect moment. The protagonist then revealed his true arsenal. Between his fingers, thin needles gleamed with a lethal energy. With a fluid and precise movement, he launched the projectiles, aiming at the enemy's exposed vital points. The beast roared in agony as its vision was taken by the sudden attack, leaving it completely vulnerable. Taking advantage of the giant's momentary blindness, the young man advanced, turning into a swift blur towards the danger. The monster tried to crush him desperately, but its clumsy blows only hit empty air as the target approached, sliding inside the open guard. The protagonist prepared the next blow, exploiting the fatal gap in the enemy's defense. The impact was violent, scattering debris through the air. The force of the blow shook the surrounding structure, raising a cloud of dust. Subaru landed lightly, maintaining perfect balance. He observed the situation with a calmness that contrasted with the chaos of the battle. His eyes narrowed in absolute focus. In that instant, he visualized the perfect trajectory and calculated the exact moment for the attack. His mind briefly traveled to the past. He recalled the days of training, launching projectiles at distant targets in the forest. The precision was absolute. The blade hit the exact center of the target, the result of exhaustive repetition and iron discipline. He remembered that specific conversation during training. His mentor, confident, explained the theory behind his unique combat style. With a mischievous smile, she held a simple pen. For her, any object could become lethal in the right hands. She adjusted her grip, demonstrating the technique. It wasn't about brute strength, but about how energy was transferred to the object at the moment of launch. With a quick and fluid movement, she threw the utensil. Her posture was impeccable as the object cut through the air towards the target. The impact was devastating, piercing the center of the target with the power of a bullet. That lesson shaped how he fought now. Back in the present, the result was the same. The monster shuddered, struck in a vital point of the neck by a tiny projectile. The colossal creature couldn't withstand the critical damage. The giant fell backward, gushing blood, defeated instantly by the surgical precision of the attack. The young man remained motionless as the enemy fell behind him. He held his weapons naturally, without showing the slightest sign of fatigue. Subaru turned, maintaining an indifferent expression. For him, that victory was nothing more than a logical consequence of his training. The instructor watched the scene, stunned. The massacre of the monsters and the young man's frightening efficiency exceeded any expectation of the simulation. With the enemy leader vulnerable, Subaru didn't hesitate. He advanced against the remaining minions, his blade moving with a lethal fluidity that cleared the battlefield. The instructor watched the scene, stunned. Sweat ran down his face as he witnessed a demonstration of skill that defied his expectations for a simple test. The enormous monster tried to stay on its feet, but its strength had been exhausted. The creature only let out groans of pain, defeated and helpless. With a dull thud, the gigantic body collapsed on the stone floor. The young man remained motionless before his fallen prey.
the dust of battle settling around him. Subaru adjusted his grip on the sword hilt. Even with the enemy on the ground, his combat instincts remained sharp, leaving no room for error. He raised the weapon for the final blow. There was no anger in his gaze, only the necessary coldness to complete the mission he had been given. The blade descended mercilessly, piercing the monster's flesh. Blood gushed out, definitively sealing the creature's fate. A holographic window appeared before him, confirming the success. The system officially recognized the Goblin King's defeat. The young man finally relaxed his posture, running a hand over his sweaty forehead. He let out a long sigh, feeling the adrenaline of combat begin to subside. The rewards began to be processed. Upon seeing the notification of the credits acquired, a smile of discreet satisfaction appeared on his face. The system continued to compute the gains, reporting that conquest points had also been granted for the exceptional performance. However, something specific in the loot list caught his attention. Subaru's eyes widened as he realized the rarity of what he had just earned. Before him floated the description of a demonic blade. It was a powerful weapon, capable of increasing his physical abilities, but it exacted a high price in mental energy. The protagonist analyzed the options carefully, comparing the items. He needed to decide which of those tools would be most useful for his future survival. The alternative was the holy sword Miranda, a blessed mithril blade. Unlike the demonic weapon, this one offered stability and reduced fatigue, a much safer choice. The protagonist analyzed the rewards floating before him. Choosing between the powerful weapons required caution,
as it would define his future combat style. He weighed the options mentally, as if they were on a scale. Indecision lingered, as each item brought distinct advantages and risks. Suddenly, a specific detail in the system interface caught his attention. His eyes gleamed as he realized a possibility that had gone unnoticed. The description of the Greed Wedge skill revealed a crucial effect:
the suppression of side effects. It was the missing piece to enable the use of cursed items. A sly smile appeared on his face as he understood the perfect synergy. With that skill, he could manipulate the system to his advantage. Without hesitation, the young man pressed the holographic panel. He decided to invest his points in the passive skill, instead of just taking a weapon. Soon after, the demonic blade materialized in his hands. He felt the weapon's power flow, now under control thanks to his new acquisition. To test the balance, he struck a quick blow in the air. The sword responded with lethal precision, ending his evaluation of the equipment. The sound of applause broke the silence. The instructor approached with an approving smile, officially ending the combat simulation. However, the examiner's gaze became analytical as he stroked his beard. He seemed to ponder the unusual performance he had just witnessed. The protagonist maintained his posture, awaiting the verdict. He realized that his display of strength had raised suspicions or curiosity. The atmosphere weighed down as the instructor projected an intimidating aura over the young man. He seemed about to question the tactics used during the test, but the tension dissipated as quickly as it arose. The man burst out laughing, revealing that the pressure was just a joke or a final test of nerves. The examiner became serious and confused again as he looked at the tablet. Something in the records or the order of the participants didn't seem to make sense. It was then that a shy boy introduced himself. Clutching his notebook and visibly nervous, he seemed to be the next to be evaluated. The imposing presence of the masked man loomed over the place. The brown-haired young man felt the weight of that aura and froze with nervousness. Trying to show respect, Yuga bowed sharply before the elite figure. He introduced himself in a hurry, the cold sweat betraying his anxiety. Meanwhile, the bold instructor decided to give a moral lesson. He complained loudly about the lack of etiquette of the new generation and how they disrespected their elders. The protagonist just listened impassively, holding his new weapon. The old man continued his speech about arrogant young people who hated inconveniences. The instructor seemed to enjoy his own lecture, laughing loudly while holding his tablet. He believed he was imposing authority over the boy, but the young man had no time for that. He simply turned his back and started walking, completely ignoring the older man's indignation. A system window appeared before his eyes. The bright warning offered the option to advance, asking if he wished to move to the second floor. His body began to dissolve into light. The instructor, realizing he was talking to himself, reached out in a futile gesture to stop him. It was too late. The man sighed, resigned and tired, realizing that the talented and rebellious young man had left without looking back. The transition was instantaneous. The protagonist's feet touched the firm ground of a new location, the landing marking his arrival at a new stage. The environment changed drastically. Shouts from vendors echoed everywhere, offering fresh fish and special meats in a vibrant market. He walked through the bustling crowd. Equipped adventurers and merchants crossed his path. ignoring the newcomer as they went about their own business. The protagonist observed the surroundings carefully. The density of that place was suffocating, and he seemed to be looking for something specific in the midst of the chaos. A serious expression took over his face. He realized that this environment would require more than just brute force to navigate. Without wasting time, he quickened his pace. His feet moved with decision, leading him away from the entrance and into the unknown city. The protagonist walked through the city with a new resolution. He knew that, this time, he would need to act much more cunningly to survive. Memories of his old companions surfaced. Remembering those happy days around the campfire reinforced why he couldn't fail now. With his objective set, the young man entered the establishment. The environment changed instantly, leaving the bustle of the street behind as he focused on his mission. Before him, a corridor displayed doors numbered in sequence. The organization of the place suggested a clear progression of levels and difficulties. As he approached the counter, the receptionist inquired about his origin. The boy responded promptly, informing him that he had just come up from the first floor. The old employee then explained the basic rule of that place. He pointed down the hallway, warning that the challenge increased drastically as the room number went up. The young man listened to the explanation in silence, absorbing every detail. He needed to understand exactly how the training system worked there to avoid unnecessary risks. The receptionist continued to gesture emphatically. He seemed to want to ensure that the guy understood the gravity of the choice he was about to make. With the information in mind and access granted, the protagonist headed to the hallway. The digital card in his hand glowed, ready to be used. The system processed the payment automatically. A portion of his credits was consumed to unlock access to the training facilities. He knew what to expect from the initial levels, which were basic. The first room only offered static training dummies for beginners. The next level, however, already presented real dangers. Spike traps emerged from the floor to test the adventurer's agility and reflexes, and the higher challenges brought deadly and crushing threats. Giant stones rolled down the corridors, requiring maximum speed to ensure survival. The young man gripped the doorknob firmly, feeling the weight of his decision. He had chosen his challenge and didn't intend to back down now. The door opened to a vast, illuminated stone hall. He took his first step inside, determined to begin his training immediately. The young man tightened his grip on the weapon's hilt, mentally preparing himself for activation. Wielding the short blade, he focused his energy, intent on unleashing the artifact's true potential. The power responded instantly, manifesting as a violent and unstable crimson aura. However, the physical toll was immediate and overwhelming, causing him to grit his teeth to withstand the internal pressure. The small blade began to transform, expanding drastically until it took the form of a large demonic sword. The overflowing energy wasn't limited to the weapon, beginning to envelop his body like dark armor. The weight of that power was almost unbearable, requiring a Herculean effort just to maintain his combat stance. His body screamed under the strain, bleeding and sweating as he fought not to be consumed by his own ability. Realizing the risk, he immediately invested a large sum of credits to raise the level of the Greed Wedge skill. The effect was instantaneous, with the skill upgraded to level 2. Suppressing the side effects allowed him to catch his breath, leaning on the sword. The residual energy from the previous impact still reverberated, demonstrating the destructive force he now held in his hands. Recovered, the young man raised the blade again. The power that had once crushed him now flowed in a controlled manner. The system confirmed that his attributes had been enhanced, and a murderous determination shone in his eyes. Feeling refreshed and stronger, he set off for a practical test, swinging the sword with speed and ferocity. Meanwhile, outside the training room, the receptionist remained completely oblivious to the chaos, taking a peaceful nap. The receptionist fought against boredom at his desk. The calmness of the shift seemed endless, and sleep began to win. Suddenly, something interrupted his rest. His senses went on immediate alert as he perceived a disturbance in the environment. A shockwave swept through the area. The man had to shield his face with his hand against the sudden force emanating from the hallway. Worried about the integrity of the facilities, he ran to the origin of the bang. Standing before the training room door, he knocked to check the situation. Receiving no immediate response, the receptionist cautiously peeked inside, fearful of what he would find. The sight before his eyes left him paralyzed. Shock took over his expression as he processed the unbelievable scene. The man could barely comprehend the devastation. The training room was in ruins, with shattered walls and a huge stone sphere blocking the way. Where there had once been training equipment, now only rubble remained. The force unleashed there had been overwhelming, destroying everything around it. The next morning arrived peacefully. Sunlight flooded the room through the window, bringing an atmosphere of peace.
The young man stretched languidly in bed. The rest had been deep after the extreme physical exertion of the previous night. A mug of hot coffee awaited on the table. It was time to fully awaken to face the new day. Already in the communal lounge, he assessed his own physical condition. The excessive tension he had felt in his body had decreased considerably, allowing him to relax. His mind, however, returned to the power of that blade. He knew that just wielding it was already a monumental challenge, let alone using its full strength in combat. A confident smile appeared on his face as he drank. Despite the technical difficulties, he was satisfied with the progress he had made. However, financial reality soon set in. Upon checking the remaining balance in the system, he realized that his evolution had come at too high a cost for his wallet. Subaru sighed, resigned to his current financial situation. Since he had died once, lamenting the lack of money seemed trivial, but the problem persisted. From upstairs, his attention was captured by a commotion in the courtyard. An extravagant streamer was doing a live broadcast, completely oblivious to his surroundings.
The young man watched as digital donations easily flowed to the influencer. Virtual credits accumulated on the screen just for him existing online. The streamer's distraction, however, resulted in an immediate accident. He clumsily collided with a woman passing by, drenching her with hot coffee. Subaru watched the embarrassing scene from above. As the confusion unfolded, he realized how that world worked differently. A calculating glint appeared in his eyes. He began to connect the dots about how he could take advantage of that new reality. The protagonist consulted the news on his device. He discovered that in this PvP era, live streams were the gold mine he needed. While engrossed in his research at the cafe, he didn't notice the silent approach of an imposing figure behind him. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. A well-dressed man stopped behind him, casually commenting on Subaru's progress in the tower. The sound of heavy boots approaching indicated that the stranger had no intention of leaving. He invaded the young man's personal space with confidence. Subaru turned sharply, his eyes wide. The shock of recognizing that presence made his heart race. His entire body tensed, and his hands trembled with contained fury. He acknowledged the man's statement, struggling not to attack right there. The newcomer leaned over the table with an arrogant familiarity, amused by the situation without realizing the imminent danger. That sadistic smile and predatory gaze were unmistakable. The malice emanating from the blonde man was exactly as Subaru remembered. The memory of the murder came back in full force. The protagonist stared at the traitor in front of him, recognizing the face of the one who had killed him. The young man looked up, dazed and dirty, trying to understand the humiliating situation he was in. Fear and exhaustion weighed on his shoulders. Before him, the blonde man stared at him with utter contempt. The traitor insulted his condition, declaring that that filthy alley was the only place suitable for him. With a chilling indifference, the guy continued to eat his snack. He watched the suffering of others as if it were mere passing entertainment. Frustration exploded in a scream of anger and despair. The protagonist, refusing to passively accept the offenses, let his emotions take control. In a blind impulse, he lunged at his opponent. It was a reckless and clumsy attack, driven only by the instinct for survival and fury. However, the man dodged effortlessly, causing the boy to collide with the ground. The traitor mocked the fall, noting how comfortable he looked among the debris. The blonde smiled maliciously, finishing his food with satisfaction. He seemed to genuinely enjoy the boy's total helplessness and humiliation. Back in the present, the protagonist stared at that same face with palpable tension. The memory of the past violently collided with the reality of the reunion at the cafe. The traitor leaned over the table, speaking with a disturbing and mocking familiarity. He narrated past events as if telling a funny joke among friends. Laughing at his own narrative, the man pointed his finger, reveling in the situation. The arrogance in his posture indicated that he felt no remorse. The young man, however, opted for silence and drank from his mug. He tried to ignore the constant provocations, focusing on maintaining his composure. The blonde man remained there, relaxed and smiling, oblivious to his listener's internal storm. He seemed to believe he was in absolute control of that interaction. Suddenly, the traitor brought his hand to his face in a theatrical gesture, perhaps laughing or hiding a reaction. Beside him, the protagonist held the mug firmly, attentive. The man's expression changed drastically to shock and confusion. He realized suddenly that something was wrong with the young man's attitude. But then, the young man's strength seemed to drain away. His body slumped forward, unable to support itself, as consciousness escaped him. The blonde man hadn't finished speaking, and his words carried a tone of poorly disguised arrogance. The protagonist tried to ignore the provocation, passing by the aggressor in the hope of avoiding a major conflict and leaving. However, a sudden perception of danger made him freeze.
Alerted by a visceral instinct, the traitor physically prevented him from leaving, grabbing his arm firmly and abruptly interrupting his retreat. The man's expression changed drastically, revealing an intense malice and a threat that went far beyond a simple fight.
While holding him, he openly mocked the young man's attitude, humiliating him in front of the others present in the place. The playfulness disappeared from his face, replaced by a focused and lethal look. He whispered a terrible threat, making it clear that he had the power to make the boy disappear without a trace. The grip was released with disdain, but the tension remained in the air as the protagonist turned to face the threat. The man's mood shifted again to a sadistic joy, laughing loudly while masking his deadly threat as friendly advice. He gestured dismissively, treating the confrontation and the boy's life as trivial and insignificant. With a fake smile, he continued his condescending speech, treating the protagonist like a harmless prey who should know their place. Before leaving, he leaned in for one last intimidating warning, ensuring that fear was etched into the young man's mind. The traitor walked away laughing, leaving behind a final sarcastic warning to be careful in the world out there. The protagonist remained still and silent, watching the figure walk away, processing the gravity of the warning he had just received. Two opposing forces ruled that world, represented by emblems symbolizing the order of the tower and the chaos of the beasts. The young man knew the only way was up. He walked up the stone steps of the dungeon, determined to overcome each step. The method to evolve quickly required clearing special dungeons on each floor.
It was a battlefield where colossal beasts tested the strength of adventurers. However, the danger was real and absolute. A single mistake resulted not only in failure, but in a horrible and definitive death in the claws of the monsters. The sinister energy pulsed at the entrance to the cave. The environment emanated an oppressive aura, warning of the horrors that awaited in the darkness.
Suddenly, a physical sensation brought him back to reality. He felt a slight impact, as if something had hit his shoulder. The protagonist rested next to the defeated orc. He reflected that choosing the safest path would only delay his growth and strengthening. The creature lay inert, with the blade embedded in its body. The violence of that world did not allow hesitation.
And he had survived another fight. With the fight over, he turned his attention to the technology in his hands. It was time to check what was happening outside that dungeon. He activated his holographic tablet, looking for updates. The device projected a familiar interface, connecting him to broadcasts from the outside world. On the screen, a masked figure appeared, making a victory sign. The man optimistically announced that they would reach the 4th floor that day. It was a live broadcast, but something was wrong. The comments in the chat mocked, pointing out that the streamer repeated the same actions and phrases incessantly. The young man watched the scene with disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. He realized that the broadcast was a repetitive and awkward cycle.
The masked man, using the name Narukami Subaru, posted an absurd quest. He offered a large sum of money, acting foolishly. Shock paralyzed the protagonist. He couldn't believe the stupidity that was being broadcast using his old identity. The masked man on the screen celebrated the new quest that had just appeared. The promised reward was high enough to guarantee his immediate excitement. While the streamer celebrated his virtual gains, the young man's reality was very different. He watched everything with disdain, sitting on the carcass of the monster he had just slain. Checking his own bank balance, the frustration was evident. With only a few credits in his account, he realized that the disparity between them was ridiculous. With a sigh of resignation, he stood up. The short break was over, and it was time to get back to the dirty work. He gripped the hilt of his weapon firmly. The sensation of power ran through his arm, bringing a confident smile to his face. Suddenly, the ground shook violently. A heavy step announced the arrival of something much larger than the previous creatures. From the shadows of the cave, an entire horde revealed itself. Dozens of red eyes glowed in the darkness, fixed on their only target. The leader of the pack finally appeared, imposing his terrifying presence. The orc general roared, challenging the intruder who dared to invade his territory. The young man faced the enemy army without showing fear. He was outnumbered, but his posture remained unwavering in the face of the threat. His passive skill activated to contain the blade's curse. With a manic smile, he decided he didn't have time to waste on external distractions. He advanced with an explosion of speed, shattering the ground beneath his feet as he launched himself against the enemies. Falling from the sky like a meteor, he plunged straight into the middle of the monster's formation, catching them completely off guard. The gravity and force of the impact were directed at a single point. The aerial attack aimed to crush any defense it encountered. The demonic blade pierced the monster's flesh without resistance. The blow was brutal, fatal, and executed with surgical precision. Moving like a blur of violence, the young man continued his offensive. His eyes shone with the same lethal intensity as his sword, reaping everything in its path. The protagonist held the dark mask in his hands, contemplating the object that would define his next step. In front of the mirror, he assessed his reflection and combat gear. The young man was preparing to assume an old identity. With a firm movement, he brought the piece to his face, covering his features and completing the transformation. Now masked, his posture changed. He knew it wasn't a farce, but the genuine embodiment of that role. Determined, he walked towards the exit. It was time to prove to the world that he was the real deal. Meanwhile, in a distant corporate office, the atmosphere seemed calm and organized. A woman attentively monitored a handheld device, but her serious expression indicated the news wasn't good. Frustration grew until she bit her lip, unable to contain her displeasure with what she was watching. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered when a man burst into the room yelling, catching her completely off guard. The shock was so intense that she lost control, reacting physically to the sudden chaos that took over the office. The intruder, visibly nervous and sweating, tried to justify his abrupt entrance by showing something urgent on his phone screen. He leaned in to explain the situation, ignoring her irritation to focus on the gravity of the problem. The man argued about the current state of the market, suggesting that the era of live broadcasts was coming to an end. The woman didn't take the pessimistic analysis well and reacted aggressively, confronting the subordinate. Faced with her fury, he just smiled awkwardly, trying to ease the tension without backing down from his point of view. In the guild office, the executive calmly checked her device. The environment seemed peaceful, and she enjoyed the moment of silence before the work routine intensified. Suddenly, the peace was shattered. A subordinate burst into the room yelling in total panic, completely startling her with his abrupt entrance and lack of composure. The man tried to catch his breath, but the expression on his face denoted the gravity of the situation. He brought urgent news that needed to be reported immediately to his superior. Upon hearing the frantic report, the woman's expression changed from shock to outrage. She demanded clear explanations about what was happening, refusing to accept that level of disorganization. Meanwhile, far away, the protagonist walked through a dark cave. He had started a live broadcast, although the audience was practically non-existent at that initial moment. Back in the office,
the employee desperately explained the failure of the second-floor broadcast's viewership numbers. The executive, frustrated, tried to process the disaster that this represented. The masked young man, however, remained focused on his mission. He didn't seem to care about external corporate politics, or who was watching him at that moment. The woman's patience ran out. With an authoritative gesture, she severely reprimanded the subordinate, who collapsed to his knees, trembling before his boss's fury. The system then issued an important warning to the hunter. He read that his conquest points would be calculated based on the number of monsters he managed to defeat in that raid. The protagonist stopped for a moment and raised his device. Something on the transparent screen caught his attention as he monitored the status of the newly opened broadcast. Finally, the viewer count began to change. A curious user sent a message in the chat asking on which floor that exploration was taking place. The young man watched the questions popping up on the screen. The audience, albeit tiny, began to interact, questioning whether this was his first attempt in the dungeon. He didn't have much time to read the messages. The silhouette of a creature emerged from the shadows ahead, stalking the lone invader who dared to enter its territory. With a sharp screech, a winged monster swooped down in a rapid dive. The beast tried to catch its prey off guard with a direct and swift aerial attack, but the hunter's reflexes were superior. Without even hesitating or looking away, he intercepted the attack, grabbing the creature's head firmly with a single hand. With a fluid and precise movement, the masked man brandished his blade. The attack was delivered with impressive speed, targeting his target with full force. The impact was immediate and devastating, splitting the ground violently. The brute force of the blow raised a cloud of debris, demonstrating the destructive power he possessed. Turning his attention to the broadcast, the young man stared at his viewers with an icy gaze through the mask. He questioned with a defiant tone whether anyone would dare object to his demonstration of strength.